process. Obvious flaws in the electoral system must be fixed before elections, not after elections. GCOM must do everything to promote and bring about consensus on the rules and the process rather than provided ammunition to one side or the other to express no confidence in the system. Charges of vote impersonation. The Madam Chair appears to put more store on election petitions after elections rather than corrective measures before elections. This is a recipe for disaster. Election petitions are not meant to correct electoral flaws. They are meant to pronounce on the fairness or lack thereof of elections. In any case, Guyana does not have a great track record when it comes to acting on election petitions in a timely manner. WPA is therefore shocked that GCOM treated with APNU AFC charges of vote impersonation at the 2020 elections in a clearly cavalier manner. The revelation by GCOM that approximately 8,000 cases of vote impersonation were flagged by the APNU AFC during the recount is most disturbing. WPA is aware that the Chief Immigration Officer returned at least one sample sent to him by GCOM chair for verification. In that sample, he found 173 out of 205 persons were not in the country on election day. That represents 84.4% of the sample being away from the country on election day. If the findings of this sample is taken as a guide, one could assume that there could have been approximately 6,800 cases of vote impersonation, enough to have changed the outcome of the election as declared by GCOM. WPA asks the following questions. Why did GCOM not send the entire list submitted by APNU AFC to the Chief Immigration Officer? Why did GCOM not inform the CARICOM observers and other observers of this development? The GCOM chair said that if the findings of the Chief Immigration Officer were found by a court to be wholly or partly accurate, then that would be a breach of the law. The GCOM therefore cover up or condone a potential breach of the law. Further, the fact that the Attorney General retrieved the list of the potential cases of vote impersonation and has not to date acted on them also raises the question of cover-up of electoral fraud in high places. WPA calls on both GCOM and the Attorney General to respond to these serious questions. Justice Singh's explanation that she would not act, or she did not act, because the charges are matters for an election petition misses the mark on two counts. First, an election petition does not preclude GCOM from mounting its own internal review or investigation of charges relating to the election. This is standard in any agency. That GCOM stoutly and repeatedly resisted calls for such action is more testimony of a cover-up. Second, the recount which was done via an ordinance was in effect an audit of the elections. The findings of such an exercise should not be treated lightly. absence of statutory documents in boxes. WPA is also dismayed by GCOM's treatment of the absence of statutory documents in 47 boxes from the East Coast of Demerara. GCOM's legal advisor told the press conference that the law mandates that all such documents, especially sensitive documents, should be in the boxes. The absence of these documents, therefore, represents another clear breach of the law. That GCOM now says that it is currently training its workers about what needs to be in the boxes is a blatant admittance of this breach. Again, WPA asks, what caused these documents to be omitted from the boxes? Who was or were responsible for the omission? Was it deliberately done? And if so, why? Were the documents destroyed? And if so, by whom? Why GCOM did nothing about these compromised boxes? Why, after rejecting GCOM's chief elections officer setting aside of the votes in the boxes in question, GCOM did not act on Commissioner Vincent Alexander's suggestion of a by-election in the affected district or districts? WPA is uncomfortable with these revelations. Everything points to a cover-up of fraud. Guyana cannot be comfortable with this situation. In a situation where members of the coalition and some GCOM staff are before the courts on charges of electoral fraud, why was there no investigation of these breaches of the law by GCOM or by the police? Management and governance of oil and gas sector. WPA is concerned about the government's undemocratic management of the oil and gas sector. The apparent management of the sector by one person and one party is unacceptable. Management of the sector is legally largely in the hands of the Natural Resource Minister, but clearly the Vice President is the czar. Whether in the hands of the Minister or the Vice President, this governance model is inappropriate. The country's oil and gas are not the property of Vice President Jack Dio or the PPP. The authoritarian approach is fraught with danger. It feeds corruption and incompetence, which are already taking their toll on the sector. Despite examples of the negative consequences of this approach to the governance of the sector across the world and warnings by local and regional experts, the government seems hell-bent on taking Guyana down that path. The complete shutting out of the political opposition from decision-making is unpatriotic and undemocratic. The opposition is constitutionally part of the formal government and thus should have some input in this very important area of the political economy. While the executive is responsible for the day-to-day management, policy formation should not be solely in their hands. WPA therefore calls for a bipartisan approach to the management and governance of the oil and gas sector. This should begin with immediate setting up of the proposed National Petroleum Commission. Such a commission is a vital necessity in an environment of hyper-partisanship. The oil and gas sector is crying out for independent non-partisan oversight, and the professional expert policy advice. We must not go to another election without this commission being in place. There must be guarantees of continuity when the elections are over. Finally, WPA is aware of a Parliamentary Natural Resources Sectoral Committee, but this committee has not been holding regular meetings. As of last year, the end of last year, members of the committee complained that the committee had not met in 30 months. In 30 months, how can there be parliamentary oversight when the committee is not meeting? This is another instance of the PPP standing in the way of oversight of the oil sector. Citizens must demand that their elected representatives be allowed to do their job of oversight. End of press statement. Can we ask Professor Thomas if he has his usual comments before we turn it back to the chair and the media for questions? Professor Thomas, you are on mute, please. You're still muted, Professor Thomas.
I think I leave my comment for the next press conference because we plan to raise the issue of further reforms in the management of the oil and gas sector. And we take the opportunity afforded by that conference to come to deal with the matters, a couple of matters that are very important going forward. But I am very unhappy about the cavalier way in which the VP had handled the last issue that we raised at his press conference. I mean, it was the regular cussing down, and I think that's most inappropriate. I think it's a sign of his weakness and his level of conceit that he bears over these matters. And instead of addressing the issues, offering to the public some assurance that they're dealing with any problems that are likely to occur with the car power ship, what he's done is to completely ignore the question. Therefore, I'm hoping that his colleagues in the government, the president, the cabinet, members of his party, as well as general citizens in Guyana, will be aware of the way in which these matters are being discussed and handled at the press conference. Thank you.
Professor Hines, do you have a perspective, please, on the recent visit by the Indian Prime Minister and his delegation?
WPA discussed the issue, and we felt that, like all Guyanese and all organizations in Guyana, we welcome the visit by Prime Minister Modi. He, of course, represents a country that has long been an ally of Guyana, going way back to the days of the non-aligned movement. He also heads a country where, from where a large segment of our population emanated. And so there are cultural ties to India. In that regard, his visit is very significant. We also took note of the fact that India has become a technological, somebody's not muted. India's become a technological giant, so to speak, and is one of the largest economies in the world. Guyana can only benefit from closer economic and cultural ties with India. We are very happy that the government was able to arrange this visit. We noted that although the Prime Minister met with the opposition leader, we regret that a delegation from the opposition was not invited to meet the Prime Minister when he arrived at Chetty Jagan Airport, the welcoming delegation. We felt the government lost a very important opportunity to show the world that we are moving towards a bipartisan approach to our governance of our country, and as we indicated earlier, governance of our oil sector. We lost a very, very, very important opportunity to put a united national face before the world. As it relates to some of the agreements and potential agreements that were discussed and agreed on agreed on by the government and Prime Minister Modi, we are still awaiting more information. So we would not like to comment on those agreements.
Have you got any updates in your talks to the PMC about rejoining the APNU?
No, we have not advanced to that point yet. We have not advanced to that point yet.
Do you think you will?
Well, we are hoping that we will. I know of attempts that are being made to either have a meeting between the PNC leader and the AFC leader, and a meeting between the PNC, AFC, and WPA leaders. But those have not been put in motion yet.
Is there a date for those meetings?
No, we have not. We are not aware of a date for those meetings yet. As we mentioned in previous press conferences, there is already a forum where the three leaders, meaning the leaders of the PPP, PNC, and WPA, are meeting on the question of GCOM matters, biometrics, the voters list, etc. So there is a forum where the leaders meet on those matters. And there is a committee that is working on those issues that comprise members of all three parties. And that committee reports to the leaders. So there is a forum where the three leaders meet. But beyond that, we have not graduated to issues as they relate to a formal coalition for the elections. Well, as Professor Thomas says, we do not find that the vice president's approach to these matters, that is resorting to cussing down, is the way to govern a country and the way to engage stakeholders. The opposition have a right to question the actions of the government, and the
And we
government.
shall always exercise that. And we will continue to exercise that right. I
Yes,
think we should make that clear, man.
yes, that we should continue to exercise, and we will continue as the WPA to exercise that right. Although we are not officially a parliamentary party, we are a party that has been in existence for the last 50 years continuously, and we therefore have that right, and we will continue to exercise that right. We raised in our press release the question for the government to clarify. The government, at the time of announcing the criteria for accessing the grant, was that all citizens needed was to have a passport or an ID card. When it was time to access the grant, other criteria were added, and of course this include scanning the registration card, the ID card of individuals, collecting information as to where they voted at the last election. Those were not announced before, and so the government sprung this on people, and we asked why you didn't announce these criteria, why you waited until the time to access to then spring it on the citizens. And we wanted to know what you needed this added information for. What is the relationship between where people voted at the last election and their accessing of the cash transfer? We feel those are important questions that the government needs to answer. Now, we are not, the government may have good reason or bad reason why it wants that added information. All we are saying, tell us why you need that information. Tell us why, in the first place, you did not say those information, that kind of information was needed. Give us the answers and let us mull over the answers that you give and then come to our own conclusion. But to behave as though we don't have a right to ask these questions and that the government alone has the right to decide when, how, and where to do things is totally unacceptable. And we wish to condemn Vice President Jack Dio for this repeated act of authoritarian governance. We in this part of the world have had our experiences before independence and after independence with authoritarian forms of government. And as we move deep into the 21st century, where the world is responding and crying out for democratic forms of governance, we expect that our government would respect the minimum of democratic governance. For too long, we have had to fetch this burden of authoritarian rule. And Vice President Jagdeo needs to stop it. He needs to stop it and to treat the people of this country with more respect, to treat political parties with more respect, and stop this business of answering questions by parties by cussing out the parties. You know, as Professor Thomas mentioned, the Vice President's response to the car
Power shift.
our power agreement. The Vice President has not answered that question. He has not said whether there was any exercise in due diligence before arriving at the decision. And we want to repeat that demand. Tell the nation whether you did a due diligence study or not. Yes or no. Exactly. Yes,